everything is expensive in Seattle. But when it comes to restaurants, I got a lot of tricks and tips up my sleeve to help diners eat well in this city. I'm Ton Ben, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW, part of the NPR network. I'll share about the latest buzz in the Seattle food scene, like the hottest openings and the best bites that are worth your money. Listen now to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Whatever you think about AI, it's driving the economy right now. According to a Harvard economist, spending on data centers and artificial intelligence accounted for 92% of U.S. economic growth in the first half of last year.
Amazon's $11 billion AI data center in Indiana, one of the largest in the world, is
That's
now
fueled
live.
speculation that we are in an AI bubble because spending on that level doesn't feel sustainable.
$40 billion in new data centers in Texas.
Meta's new $10 billion data center in Richland Parish, Louisiana.
If the bubble pops and the spending stops, the shockwave could hit all of us. We've been here before. Runaway economies cause real pain when they collapse. The wreckage includes bankruptcies, lost retirement savings, disappearing jobs. After the stock market crash in 1929, we had the Great Depression. After the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, a lot of people lost their homes to foreclosure. But sometimes the crash leaves something good behind that we may not fully appreciate for years. From KUOW in Seattle, this is Booming. I'm Joshua McNichols. Today, we look at bubbles from the past and ask, when the money burns away, what's left? That's coming up.
This is the greatest bubble story of all time. Back in the 1600s, the Dutch, they get speculation fever to the point that you could buy a beautiful house on a canal in Amsterdam for the price of one bulb. They called it tulip mania.
We've been hearing so much about this AI boom that we're in and what will happen if it goes bust. But there's this moment from another bubble that I just can't stop thinking about. It's the bubble that built the modern internet. I remember this time in 1999 when I was buying shoes in downtown Seattle, and there was an executive of a small telecom company sitting next to me, and he was just gushing about the ridiculous amount of money pouring into his industry and how they were laying fiber optic cable everywhere with almost no rhyme or reason. It's kind of like in a video game when your warrior goes into berserker mode and just blindly lashes out in every direction. These telecom companies were in berserker mode, fueled by all that money they were spending to cover the U.S. in a spider web of these higher-grade cables that could carry huge amounts of data. Those companies grew too quickly. The demand just wasn't there yet. And when they fell, they hit the ground hard. Several giant telecom companies worth tens of billions of dollars went bankrupt. Small internet carriers went under too. I had this nagging suspicion that earlier bubble has something to teach us as we discuss the AI bubble that we might be in today. So I went to Margaret O'Mara for some perspective. She's an economic historian, and she drew connections between the past and the present that I had no idea existed.
I'm Margaret O'Mara. I'm a professor of history at the University of Washington.
So take us back to the telecom bubble of the late 1990s when investors were pouring crazy amounts of money into telecom companies so they could rip up streets and lay out massive amounts of fiber optic cable. Like, what did the future look like in their heads?
Well, there'd been a massive transformation in the entire telecom industry, starting with the breakup of AT&T, the beginning of the 80s, and then accelerated in the 1990s by the commercialization of the internet and this incredible opportunity that seemed to be underway, where the entire economy was moving online. Every company was putting a .com at the end of their name or building a website. And there seemed to be great promise and great upside. And so this was the essential plumbing to make it all happen. And there were a lot of incentives, a lot of capital, private capital in the stock market. And there also was a favorable regulatory environment that was creating all these opportunities in an industry that had been dominated for a very long time. And now suddenly there was all this opportunity for newcomers to get a hand in.
Fiber optics as a technology is really common today, but I'd love to just set some basics. Like, what is fiber? Why was it the big technology of the moment at this period?
Well, telephone lines are really good for voice communication. If you're sending bits and bytes and information and documents, music and all sorts of things, it requires more. It's the same way that when we're talking on the phone, it's not as perhaps the voice quality isn't as good as if we're talking on an internet-enabled connection. So there was a real eagerness, both in terms of public policymakers and also from the companies themselves, to create a more robust network that would allow more things, for websites to be more sophisticated, for media to be transmitted. The story of all digital computing is about moving at the speed of light, moving faster. So it's speed, it's capacity, it's everything.
Yeah. When the telecom bubble burst, which was basically when the .com bubble burst, what happened to all that fiber optic cable that was laid?
Well, it was a big infrastructure push well ahead of the market demand. I mean, first of all, one of the things, and this is kind of related to why the .com boom ended up in a bust as well, that some of these companies that were presenting, offering consumers opportunity to buy things like dog food on the internet were coming in well ahead of market demand, well ahead of consumers being comfortable enough to put their credit card into their computer and feel that it was a safe transaction. In the very early days of Amazon, people would send them physical checks in the mail because they didn't trust doing a financial transaction on the internet. Yeah. And the software was indeed like the first things that made a credit card transaction secure were still relatively new technologies. Now we buy all sorts of things on the internet with comfort. There was a reason that Amazon, for example, started just selling books, because that was something that, couldn't break in the mail, that was at a low enough price point that people might be willing to take a bet on buying something. And, even if it didn't work out, you were only out $20. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, the late 90s, this is when, consumers were still mostly dialing up with the AOL, remember the noises that your computer would make.
Yeah, the bong, bong,
bong.
Yeah.
This is a very different world. And also there wasn't kind of on the software side, there weren't the capability to stream multimedia, there just wasn't there yet. So there, at the end of the 90s, you had about 90% of the fiber infrastructure that had been laid, the series of tubes that was the internet, to paraphrase the late Ted Stevens of Alaska, that was just unused. It was dark. It was well ahead of the demand, and then the stock market crashes, and there were some very big companies that went under as a result of that.
Yeah, so that fiber optic cable under the ground just kind of laying there.
Just laying there.
Yeah. Before we started today, in an earlier conversation we had, you told me about an example from the Dalles, Oregon, a little town on the Columbia River just over the border from Washington. What is the story of the Dalles in terms of this telecom bubble that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, the Dalles is on the Columbia River Gorge, about 10,000 people. It's right by the Dalles Dam, which is one of the big hydroelectric dams on the Columbia River. And during the late 1990s, it was like a lot of small towns in eastern and Washington and Oregon was kind of trying to figure out its next economic act, some job creation. And towns of its size were kind of bypassed by this big boom in telecom build-out. The population wasn't big enough to merit all of this laying of cable that was happening in cities like Seattle or Portland. So the local leaders there decided to invest in a local fiber optic network to kind of tie it into this bigger internet wave of infrastructure that was coming, and to make it a kind of an online connected place in the hopes that this would attract more employers, more activity on this new .com wave. Now, that turned out to be not a great bet initially, because then the .com boom ends in a bust and all of that activity slows down. So about 5 years after the dot-com bust, there is a relatively new Silicon Valley company named Google that is going hunting for a place to build its own data center. It needs a place that has a lot of storage capacity and processing capacity that's secure, that it can control, because Google has just launched a little online email program called Gmail, and suddenly is now venturing beyond just being a search company and into cloud software. This is the very beginning of the cloud era. And so the location scout for Google comes to the Dalles, sees that there is cheap land, there's cheap electricity, and there happens to be some local fiber optic cable and good capacity in there. And also the state of Oregon had a really nice tax break program that tech companies like Google and others have taken great advantage of in the years since. And a very large single-use data center is built by Google that opens in around 2006. It's the same year that Microsoft is opening a similar data center up in Quincy. This is the beginning of the great data center era along the Columbia River Gorge and the Columbia River Basin.
So you've described this unique example where the Dalles was part of this bubble and promoted telecom fiber everywhere and eventually benefited from it, not immediately, but after a while. To what extent is the Dalles story an analogy for the telecom bubble across other parts of the region?
Well, in some ways, it's an interesting example of sort of the serendipity and the lucky breaks that are involved in all of these things. Could they have predicted this would be what it was? And it should be noted that the big advantage that the Dalles did and continues to have was the dam and the electricity flowing from it. That's really what draws these data centers to these towns and places along the Columbia River, same as other parts of the United States. However, it's a good example of it isn't to say every municipality should make these big swings that's going to pay off eventually, but it does pay off eventually. I think the way to think about, when we're sitting here in this AI moment where there's a massive amount of capital expenditure that's going on, private capital expenditure, a lot of there's some public expenditure as well at the national and the state and the local level, that there is, yes, some of it is going to be for naught. It is a risky bet. And some of it may well pay off in ways that aren't expected. Any of these new technological waves do take a while to crest. But one of the things that I have learned from being a historian of American business is that predicting what happens next can be pretty dangerous business.
Yeah. To what extent did the telecom, fiber optic cables that were laid during the telecom boom play a role in the AI boom that we're seeing today?
Yeah. It created this backbone, this infrastructure, this material infrastructure that's necessary for the internet boom to happen. There were a lot of hopes for the commercial internet in the late 90s that weren't immediately realized, but they weren't wrong. The idea that the internet was going to be a foundational, fundamental platform shift, a shift in the way that people worked and bought things and communicated with one another, that was real. And so this physical infrastructure was necessary, just as the build-out of cloud infrastructure over the last 15 years has required the erection of these massive data centers and the network capacity to bring all of the data that's being processed and stored several hundred miles away from its end user. That connectivity needed to be there. So all of this build-out that starts in the 1990s ultimately has a purpose. It's an actual literal World Wide Web of cable and metal and routers and all of these things that we don't think about when we kind of close our eyes and think about artificial intelligence. It seems magic and seems like it lives in the air, but it doesn't. Now, those profiting from it and those using it are not necessarily the same people who built it or imagined what it would be used for. So but it is all connected.
We'll hear more from Margaret after a quick break. Coming up next, other bubbles and what they have to tell us.
Are you dreading increasingly shorter days and longer nights? Do cold, overcast northwest winters bum you out? You may be suffering from the big dark, but there is a solution. I'm Dyer Oxley, telling you to talk to your podcast app about Meet Me Here, KUOW's arts podcast, a weekly dose of events and culture to lighten up your life. Side effects of Meet Me Here include laughter, curiosity, and inspiration. Find Meet Me Here on your local KUOW app or wherever you get your podcast.
You know, you've told me that there are other bubbles in history that have lessons for us about the present. What are they?
Well, one of the bubbles that I think about, and I'm not alone in thinking about this, other historians and observers have noted, is the railroad boom of the 1860s and 70s, which was this extraordinary explosion of construction of railroads, particularly the transcontinental railroads that stretched across the United States, that's fueled in great part by federal subsidies for that railroad construction. The federal government during the Civil War passes the Transcontinental Railway Act of 1862, which creates all sorts of incentives for entrepreneurs to establish railroad companies that are trying to build these lines from east to west. It creates this rush for many, many companies and many, many different transcontinental lines being built or attempted to be built. That kind of like AI is happening on a hope and a prayer rather than actual market demand or revenue. And it is also kind of similar to AI, something that involves a lot of circular deal making where people are in business with one another. Money is being made, but it is a very tightly interconnected web of finance and a lot of railroads taking on a lot of debt in order to build these lines that required a lot of capital expenditure, kind of like AI.
So that sounds kind of like a very shaky foundation on which to make these major investments. I assume that bubble burst, and what did it leave us?
Well, it did burst in pretty spectacular fashion with the Panic of 1873, which was precipitated. It was actually a global economic crisis. The European stock market has a crash, and because so much European capital had been invested in these railroads, a lot of the money was from Europe. They started calling on that debt. A lot of railroads failed. Everything goes sideways. And this has reverberations across the economy. It's not just railroads that go sideways. This results in an economic depression that lasts many years and causes all sorts of political as well as economic instability across the United States. There are many parts of the United States that really never quite recover, and it is a factor in subsequent economic panics in the 1880s and 1890s and depressions that result. So there's a long-running instability. That's the sad part of the story. Some of these railroads go bankrupt. They tear up their tracks just to resell this metal for scrap, just to get something out of it. But, I mean, railroads didn't go away. In fact, railroads continue to go on to become the major transportation network that is driving the economy and expanding settlement across North America and other continents for decades to come.
When you zoom out and look at history, what do all these bubbles have in common?
There is some new technological wave that is of a size and an import that it's clear something is changing and something is happening, and that there is great economic opportunity to be gained. And out of these bubbles, indeed, there are always some winners. Sometimes they're short-term winners, investors who happen to get their money out and get a big return before everything goes sideways. There also are usually, a few companies left standing. The rule of high-tech venture capital is 1 in 10 of your investments hopefully pays for the rest of them, right?
1 in 10.
1 in 10. That's not a high hit rate. I mean, sometimes we think about, this is all just people making money and up and to the right. And during these booms, people are assuming, I'm going to be a millionaire or a billionaire too. And actually, sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. And sometimes the people who get lucky think that they got lucky because they're, just so much smarter than everyone else. I can tell you, I've been looking at this stuff for a long time. Oftentimes they're smart, but they're also really lucky.
All right. So if the AI boom cools off and crashes, what do you think we'll still be using 10 or 20 years from now, long after the hype fades?
Oh, goodness. This is where the history professor knows not to make bold predictions. But I will say what's really interesting about this boom, this is not quite answering your question, but I think it's worth kind of a contrast to, say, the dot-com boom, is that the AI boom, the central players there's some new players like OpenAI, for example, But a lot of the central players are companies like Microsoft and Amazon, and ones that have been the big hits of previous generations. They are very established companies. They are the most valuable companies in the world. They're the most valuable companies in human history. And that doesn't mean that they're, too big to fail or anything like that. In the very long view, everyone becomes a dinosaur someday. I'm not saying they're going to be anytime soon. But it's really interesting that the AI story is one in which so many incumbents are playing a critical role. And part of this has to do with the immense amount of money it takes to build out this data infrastructure. That in order to play in the AI game, you have to partner with one of the big platform companies because they're the only ones with the data centers, with the servers, with the chips, with the resources, both the cash on hand and the ability to take on the debt and to get the financing for this extraordinary amount of money it takes. It's certainly taking at this front end to launch the AI era.
Well, Margaret, I learned so much talking with you today.
Well, it's great talking to you. Thanks.
That's it for Booming. Thanks so much for listening. If you have a question about the economy that you want us to answer, email us at booming@kuow.org or leave us a voicemail at 206-221-7158. Thanks to those of you who are donating to the show. We recently got an awesome donation from Marcy, so shout out to Marcy. If you want to be like Marcy and support the stories you hear on Booming, go to kuow.org/booming. Thanks. Our producers are Lucy Suchek and Alec Cowan. Our editor is Carol Smith. Booming is co-hosted by me, Joshua McNichols, and Monica Nicholsberg. We'll see you next time.
I'm a firm believer that nature is healing. In these chaotic times, I invite you to take a breath and reconnect with our natural world. Wow, right in front of us. I'm Chris Morgan. Join me on The Wild as we explore stories of hope and resilience in nature. We'll bring you up close to some extraordinary species and learn how they are finding ways to adapt and thrive in fast-changing environments. Listen to The Wild on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.